Hello, and welcome to a new video of CMU Gen Cyber. Today we'll be discussing cyber law and ethics, so hopefully it will be a fun and thought-provoking session. Before we jump in, I just want to point out two things. One, these slides are up to date with material up to March 2024, but the cyber law and political landscape are frequently changing. So if you ever watch this video a few years out in the future, please note that some of the material would need updating. And second, there are multiple opinions possible about the various topics and issues that we bring up in this video. So the goal of this video is not to tell you what is right or wrong, but to provide you with some legal and ethical frameworks for making these decisions and inspiring such discussions in the classes. So with that, today we'll be discussing three main things. First, the US domestic law. Second, international law. And third, we will discuss ethics and case studies. The first part of this video will focus on domestic law, and the second video will focus on the other two portions. When it comes to domestic law, we want to talk about two things, the US government, and also to give you an overview of the US law. So beginning with the US government, we probably already learned, but there are three branches of the US government because of the separation powers that we desire in the US Constitution. There is the legislative branch, which is mentioned in the Article 1 of the US Constitution, and the main function is to, well, make laws. And then there is the executive branch, which is defined in the Article 2 of the US Constitution, and its main function is to actually execute or carry out these laws. And finally, there is the judicial branch, which is defined in the Article 3 of the US Constitution, and its main function is to interpret laws. For example, is this law constitutional or not? And there are two parties in the US government. The US government is a two-party system where there are two major political parties consistently dominating the political landscape. There is the Democratic Party, which often is represented by the color blue and the symbol donkey, and there is the Republican Party, which is often represented by the color red and the symbol elephant. And there are some representatives, senators, and political actors in the Independent Party, but this party isn't big, so we usually focus on the two parties, the Democratic and the Republican parties. There's also a concept called bipartisan, which is an agreement or cooperation between two parties. And the reason we talk about bipartisan is that bipartisan actions and agreements are really necessary when it comes to cyberspace. For example, we see there being a Cyberspace Solarium Commission, or the CSC, which was a bipartisan intergovernmental body created in 2019 for cyber strategies. Now it continues to work as a nonprofit, but this was an example of a bipartisan effort in the cyberspace. So if we go more in depth into the legislative branch is consists of the Congress, which consists of the upper body, the Senate, and the lower body, the House of Representatives. They meet at the US Capitol for discussing various issues and voting on various issues. So the Senate and the House of Representatives have different ways of how they select who serves on this body. So the Senate consists of 50 senators, which are 2 senators per state, versus the House of Representatives consists of 435 representatives, and how many representatives per state depends on the state population surveyed by the US Census. You will often hear the term Speaker of the House. Basically, this is a position that refers to the political and the parliamentary leader of the House. At the moment, we see that the Democratic Party is the majority party in the US Senate, and the Republican is the minority party. This is flipped in the House of Representatives. The Republicans make up the majority of the House, and the Democrats make up the minority. And when it comes to the types of legislation, we see that there are two main types, bill and resolution. Bill is the more binding type, and if passed by the House and the Senate and signed by the President, it becomes binding law and part of the US Code. whereas the resolution is merely more of an expression of the sentiments of the House or Senate. So if we look on the right of the screenshots, we actually see a bill and a resolution related to the cyberspace. So the first bill that we see, it is a bill to direct the Director of Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, to establish a K-12 cybersecurity technology improvement program and for other purposes. Whereas the resolution is a resolution designating June 2023 as National Cybersecurity Education Month. So it is a bit more casual, expressing the sentiments and the overall opinions of the House or Senate, whereas the bill is a bit more binding and detailed. So if we go into more in depth of how to actually read what a legislation looks like. So if you go to congress.gov and you can search up cybersecurity and find cyber-related legislation. And if you look, the first part denotes whether it's a bill or resolution or any other types of action. And in the number HR 2845, this denotes which body it originated from. So this originated from the House of Representatives, whereas Bill number 2, S1191, the S denotes the Senate. So this originated from the Senate. And actually, the procedure for these two are slightly different in that you have to first pass the House for House originating bills, and for Senate originating bills, you have to first pass the Senate and then move on to the House and then the President and become law. So the 2845 and the 1191, the numbers next to the letters represent the number of the bill. And you can also see the title of the bill or the resolution right beneath the numbers. And you can also see who sponsored it. For example, the first bill was sponsored by Doris Matzel, who is a representative of the Democratic Party in California. She introduced it in April 2023, and you can also see who co-sponsored it. And this originated out of the Committee of the Homeland Security, as well as Education and the Workforce. And if in the third highlighted box, you can also see the latest action taken on the bill, as well as a tracker where it is throughout the progress. So a classroom idea could be to find and describe a cyber-related legislation by going to congress.gov. Now moving on to the executive branch. So probably the first person that you think of when it comes to the executive branch is the President of the United States. So the executive branch is made up of the president and vice president, who serves 4 years per term and have a 2-term limit. And at the moment, the president of the United States is President Joe Biden, and the vice president is Kamala Harris. And then we have the cabinet, who are the official advisory council to the president. And it consists of 15 secretaries who serve as department heads, as well as 10 cabinet level officials. So we talked about how secretaries lead the departments, and the departments are administrative units of the president, and there are 15 of them, including Department of Treasury, Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, which we will talk about. So when it comes to cyber-related presidential actions, we see that the president can issue documents and execute presidential actions through executive orders. So these are official documents issued by the president to manage the operations of the federal government. And an example that you may see is an executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. This was issued in May 2021. So this is kind of one way the president shows their interest and devotion to a particular issue. The second thing I want to highlight is the National Cybersecurity Strategy, which talks about strategies for a safe and secure digital ecosystem for Americans. This was published in March 2023, and the implementation plan was published in July 2023. So through documents such as these, you can kind of see where the future of the US cybersecurity programs and ideas are headed. So this may be one interesting document to read about in your classes. So talking about some cyber-related departments, there is the Department of Defense or the DoD, which deals with national security and the U.S. Armed Forces. And we see that within U.S. Armed Forces, there is the U.S. Cyber Command or U.S. Cybercom established in 2009. There is also the National Security Agency, NSA. You've probably heard of it because we are the CMU NSA Gen Cyber program. So NSA does a lot of cyber-related functions. So you see that the chief of the US Cybercom and the director of the NSA are currently the same person. It is General Timothy Hawk, and he leads both agencies or departments. And there's the Department of Energy or DOE, and you may be thinking, what does energy have to do with cybersecurity? But DOE deals with energy policy, production, and research, and there have been increasing threats to cyber threats to critical infrastructure. And because DOE deals with electricity, nuclear, and infrastructure critical to the day-to-day needs of US civilians, it often has to focus on cybersecurity as well. So you may often hear DOE and cybersecurity. Another department that is pretty prominent in today's world is the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, which focuses on public security. In 2018, there was CISA established within the DHS. CISA stands for Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and the current director is Director Jen Easterly. And a fun fact is that Director Jen Easterly actually came to CMU's campus last year in 2023 and met with Scilab and Pico CTF. She also gave a talk. And there is the Department of Commerce, and underneath it, there is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. And NIST deals with innovation and industrial competitiveness, and you will often hear about NIST published frameworks and guidelines such as the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and the NIST Password Guidelines. And finally, there is the Department of Justice, DOJ, which deals with federal law and justice enforcement. And underneath DOJ, there was famously the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI. And the FBI actually has a cyber division that was established in 2002. So a classroom idea for a classroom activity would be asking students to choose a department and to describe its roles and its responsibilities, and perhaps even past actions, past and current actions in the cyberspace. So if we look at the FBI website and go to cybercrime, we can actually see some major cybercrime cases it's worked on over the years, including a Russian hacking of a US bank in 1994, as well as a botnet operation that it disabled. Finally, outside of these departments, there are also cyber-related positions, such as the Director of National Intelligence, or DNI, who runs the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. They oversee the U.S. intelligence community, which consists of various agencies we talked about, such as NSA, FBI, but also the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. And there is also the Director of National Cyber, or DNC, who runs the Office of the National Cyber Director, or ONCD. This is a pretty recent position formed in 2021, and they are responsible for advising the president on cybersecurity related issues. So the reason I talk about these different positions is that you will likely hear about one or more of them when you're reading cybersecurity related news or going through various documents online. So I just wanted you to be familiar with some of the terminologies and some of the departments in the cyberspace. So finally, moving over to the judicial. So the judicial branch is made up of the Supreme Court, or SCOTUS, as is sometimes abbreviated, and the Supreme Court has 9 justices serving. It's currently led by Chief Justice John Roberts, and to become a justice, you need to go through a presidential nomination and a Senate confirmation. And in contrast to the limited terms that you saw for representatives or senators or even the president and vice president, being a justice is a life tenure. The Supreme Court receives around 7,000 to 8,000 cases a year to review, and it agrees to hear around 80 to 150 cases. So a mere fraction of the cases that it receives. And on the right, you see a beautiful photo of the current Supreme Court justices. When it comes to judicial, there are two types of court cases that we need to consider. There is the criminal case and there is the civil case. The criminal case, as you could tell from its name, deals with crimes. It's conduct perceived as threatening or harmful to property, safety, or welfare. On the most severe level, there would be the felony, such as murder or arson, but on slightly less severe levels, you could be prosecuted with misdemeanor or summary offense. In a criminal case, there is the prosecutor and the defendant involved. The prosecutor represents the government to present the case before court, and the defendant is the party accused of breaking the law. And in a criminal case, you have to prove guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Let's go on to the civil case. So the civil case refers to almost every other types of legal action except criminal, such as it could be a corporate law case, such as a court contract dispute, a family case, such as divorce, or a consumer case, such as faulty items. And in civil case, there is the plaintiff or the party bringing legal action, and the defendant, the party accused of the alleged harm. And different from the criminal case, you have to present evidence that is more persuasive than the opposing party's evidence. And you will often see that there are sometimes cases which could be either criminal or civil. They choose to go either route depending on whether they can prove guilty beyond a reasonable doubt or present evidence that is more persuasive. So that could be one factor in choosing either criminal or civil. Another factor in deciding whether one case should be criminal or civil could be what result do you want after the case? Do you want monetary compensation or do you want the other party in prison? So these could be various factors into deciding one over the other when one could fall under criminal or civil. So a classroom idea could be finding and discussing a cyber-related court case. Maybe you could choose one criminal and one civil case to discuss. So if you go to Supreme Court opinions, these are basically documents that announce a decision by the Supreme Court and provide a legal rationale for the decision. And it consists of the following parts: the syllabus, which is a summary of the Supreme Court opinion, the main opinion, which is the official decision and the rationale, and then you will often find concurring and dissenting opinions on the document as well. The concurring opinion agrees with the main opinion, but based the decision on a different rationale, whereas the dissenting opinion disagrees with the main opinion. For example, this is a Supreme Court opinion of the Van Buren versus United States 2021 Supreme Court case, and you see that it starts with the syllabus, the summary of the opinion. It talks about who is involved. It's Van Buren and the United States. It talks about when this case was argued and decided, so November 2020, and it was decided June 3rd, 2021. And it talks about what this case is about. So this case is actually about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986, CFAA, and what the terminology exceeds authorized access means in CFAA. So CFAA we will discuss slightly later when talking about statutory law. But feel free to go into this document more in detail and discuss with your classrooms about what you think of this case. So now moving over to the second part, the US law, I want to point out that there are four main sources of US law. First, constitutional law, which is based on the US Constitution. Second, statutory law, based on federal and state legislation. Third, administrative or regulatory law, which are rules issued by federal or state administrative agencies. And finally, common law, including case law, which are judge-made law. And you will see that in common law, the decision made by the court often becomes precedent for cases to come. In this video, we will mostly focus on constitutional and statutory law, but feel free to definitely explore administrative law and common law in your classrooms. To give an overview of the constitutional law, as you can probably tell from the name, is based on the US Constitution, which was written in 1787 and ratified in 1788. The preamble contains the purpose of the document and the famous three words, we the people, and the US Constitution is made up of 7 articles. We've already discussed 3 of them. 1, 2, and 3 talk about the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of the US government. And the 5th one talks about the amendment process. And why this is so important is that there are amendments, official amendments introduced to the US Constitution. At the moment, there are 27 amendments, and the first 10 amendments are called Bill of Rights, and these were ratified in 1791. So one amendment that is especially prominent in the cyberspace is the Fourth Amendment. On a high level, this amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures. And if we actually go into the text, it reads, the rights of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. And then it goes on to talk about warrants and when warrants can be issued and so on. So putting the Fourth Amendment in practice, there was a case in 1928, Olmsted versus the United States. And this was a case where Olmsted was a police officer who sold illegal goods, or we call it bootlegging, and a federal investigation team wiretapped his business calls outside of the office. And the outcome was 5-4 opinion in that warrantless wiretapping is permissible. And why this outcome is so significant is that you can't use evidence that you collect illegally in court. So if Olmsted was able to prove that this action by the federal investigation team was unconstitutional and illegal, then the federal investigation team can't use these wiretapped evidence in court. But the outcome was that warrantless wiretapping is permissible. And the rationale was that private telephone calls are no different from casual conversations overheard in public place. And interestingly, a few decades later, in 1967, there was a case that overturned this decision, Katz versus the United States. In this situation, Katz engaged in illegal sports gambling, and FBI agents attached an eavesdropping device outside of a public phone booth that Katz used, and the outcome was very different. There was 7-1 opinion that warrantless wiretapping is not permissible, overturning the prior case. And the rationale was the Fourth Amendment protects people, not places, and what someone seeks to preserve as private, even in a public area, an area accessible to the public, such as a public phone booth, this may be constitutionally protected. There was also a concurring opinion. If you remember, concurring opinion agrees with the outcome that warrantless wiretapping is not permissible, but on a different rationale. And this basically established a reasonable expectation of privacy, or the Katz test. Feel free to go in depth or look it up. This is really interesting. So a classroom idea would be taking stuff such as the Fourth Amendment and parts of the Constitution and talking with your students about how the Constitution protects or fails to protect different aspects of our cyber lives with your students. Moving on to statutory law. Statutory law is based on federal and state legislation, for example, the Congress and the United States Code. The United States Code is an official codification of the general and permanent federal statutes of the United States, and there are 53 titles 1 to 54, except Title 53, which is being reserved. Title 6 talks about domestic security, and within it, we actually see a chapter on cybersecurity, Chapter 6. There is also Title 10, Armed Forces, and in Part 1, Chapter 19, sections 391 to 399, it talks about cyber and information operations matters. So we see that even within the United States Code, there are sections related to cybersecurity. And you can go to the website and search within the US Code. So probably one really well-known section within the US Code is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, or the CFAA, and it is within Title 18, Crimes and Criminal Procedure, Part 1, Crimes, and Chapter 47, Fraud and False Statements under Section 1030. And this was a law enacted in 1986 targeting computer-related crimes, and it includes sections regarding computer espionage, computer trespassing, committing fraud with a computer, and damaging a protected computer, including through viruses and worms. And putting CFAA in practice was actually used in criminal cases, such as the United States versus Morris in 1991, where the United States government convicted Robert Morris for creating and releasing the Morris worm, which is one of the first internet-based worms. It was also used in 2011 in a case United States versus Schwartz, where the government convicted Aaron Swartz for systematically downloading academic articles from JSTOR. It's also being used in civil cases as well, not just criminal. So there was a case in 2011 between Sony Computer Entertainment America and Holtz for convicting Holtz for jailbreaking and reverse engineering PlayStation 3. So CFAA is pretty important in dealing with computer crimes. However, it also has its problems and controversies. For example, we see articles referring to it as quotation mark, the worst law in history, and quotation mark, the most hated law on the internet, and talking about its problems and how to fix it. So a classroom idea could be going more into depth about CFAA and talking about its effectiveness with students. What does it try to accomplish? How does it try to accomplish? Do you agree or disagree with any portions of it? And how can we rethink CFAA for the better? Moving on to some other interesting federal legislation that you'll often hear about, one is called Section 230, and it is part of the US Code Title 47 Telecommunications, and basically it provides immunity for online services regarding third-party content generated by its users. So it's often been, it's often being used by social media companies and whether they should take responsibility for what their users post online. And two famous Supreme Court cases recently in 2023, which Section 230 is involved with, include Twitter versus Tamna and Gonzalez versus Google. And a classroom idea, especially since many students use social media and are familiar with Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and so on, X or so and so on, are what are your thoughts on Section 230? Who does it protect, harm, and what are some opportunities and challenges from Section 230? Another interesting legislation on a state level is our privacy regulations, because currently at the moment, the US does not have a nationwide privacy regulation, but there are legislation by state. One prominent example is the California Consumer Privacy Act, or the CCPA, which was established in California Civil Code Division 3, Part 4, and it intends to enhance privacy rights and consumer protection for California residents. It was passed by the California State Legislature and signed into law in June 2018 and was effective from January 2020. You will also hear CPRA, or California Privacy Rights Act, or Proposition 2024, along with CCPA, because this was passed in November 2023, and it amended and expanded the privacy rights in CCPA. So if you look at this nice map by IAPP, which has useful information regarding privacy, you can track the US state privacy legislation across different states, introduced in committee, in cross-chamber or committee, and whether it was passed, signed, and so on. And a classroom idea could be talking about, should the US implement a nationwide privacy regulation? And what would it look like? What are some portions that you think should be included in such a regulation? So that concludes the domestic part of this presentation. And in the next video, we will deal more with international law and various case studies and ethics. Thank you.